Early morning, May the 25th. It's been almost 2 weeks since 7551 East derailed, slamming into San Bernardino. But the cleanup was fast. For more than a week, the trains and the fuel in a pipeline below have been running smoothly. Then, from a clear sky, rain seems to fall. Large sections of the neighborhood are soaked by this peculiar shower. Ruth Green is back in her house when for the second time in a month, she's confronted with a horrifying sight.
To the left of me, as far as I could see up, down, or side to side, was nothing but a big wall of fire. I got to the front door, neighbors were screaming, "Get out, get out." I ran for my life.
Once again, the fire department responds to a major disaster on Duffy Street.
As we're getting the call and getting on the rig and opening the door, there was no doubt in my mind what that was. You could see a huge column of smoke and flame, and I knew immediately it had to be the pipeline.
A tower of smoke and flame reaches more than 100 meters into the sky.
Initially, when we got in there, we were so close that the plastic lenses on the front of the engine melted. Several of the turn signals, part of the red lights, melted. There was an intense noise coming from this pipeline where it had ruptured. It sounded like a jet engine. Deafening is how I would describe it. And we dealt with that all day long.
Local firefighters aren't the only ones called back to the scene.
I got a call report to the chairman's office. I went down to the chairman's office, notified that the pipeline blew up, and that I should get my team together again.
The area looked more or less like a war zone, where a lot of damage, a lot of fire damage had been done. Houses in the area were incinerated.
Once again, Calnev, which runs the pipeline, can't shut its emergency valves. Almost 2 million liters of fuel burn for more than 7 hours. By the time the flames are out, 2 people are dead. 3 more are injured. Another 11 houses have been destroyed. The residents of San Bernardino are in shock.
They talked about the fact that one of the people that died, that all they really could find was their shoes that were left in one spot. And that, you know, the mental picture of that, it troubles you quite a bit.
After the fire, it was over for me. I couldn't see myself living in the house anymore. It really scared me just that bad.
What people here will soon learn is that all of the damage, pain, and suffering is the result of a simple, horrifying mistake. A small neighborhood in San Bernardino, California, has been devastated by 2 disasters. In just 13 days, a train derailment and a gas explosion have ripped through the area, killing 6 people. Investigators with the National Transportation Safety Board study both accidents. With the train crash, they focus on black boxes, which were recovered from 3 of the engines.
And that records distance, speed, throttle position, air brake pressures that we tried to figure out what speed the train eventually got to. It exceeded the graph.
The black boxes reveal that 7551 East had probably reached the incredible speed of 177 kilometers per hour before derailing. The speed limit on the curve was just over 60 kilometers an hour. Although the train's brakes had been applied, it continued accelerating. How had the train become so out of control?
Almost all accidents are a chain of events that link together to cause the accident. Of course, any one point, if you'd broken that link, you know, the accident wouldn't have occurred.
Like other freight trains, 7551 East has two different systems to slow it down: dynamic brakes and air brakes. Air brakes push a block against the wheels of each freight car. The greater the pressure applied to the block, the slower the train goes. Investigators learned that the air brakes were working properly as the train started down the hill. As the train sped up, though, engineer Frank Holland maintained pressure on the air brakes. The heat created by the brakes became so intense that they melted. By the time of the crash, they were useless. The team turns its focus to the dynamic brakes. The dynamic brakes harness a magnetic field created by the engine's main generator. They reverse the magnetic field, which slows the axles on the locomotive. There were 4 engines at the front of the train and 2 at the back. Before beginning his trip, engineer Frank Holland knew that his second engine wasn't working at all, and that the dynamic brakes on his 4th engine were only working sporadically. Still, it was more than enough.
And we figured that with the units that we had on the head end and the 2 helpers that they gave us later on, we could do 30 miles an hour down that grade with no problem.
When his train starts down the mountain, Holland has it under control. With the brakes he has, he should be able to hold his speed, but he can't.
Frank, we're at 30.
Should be at 25.
It's creeping.
What the NTSB investigators discover from the black boxes is stunning. The brakes on the 3rd engine at the front of the train didn't work at all as 7551 East gathered speed. During the trip, Holland had even checked with the brakeman in the 3rd engine.
Alan,
Yeah,
what are your dynamics like?
they're revving.
But the black boxes show investigators that even though the dynamic brakes were making the noise they usually make, they weren't working. They weren't helping slow the train down at all. But it gets worse.
Coupled and ready to go.
Roger
Of
that.
the 2 engines added to the back of the train, one didn't have any braking power either. Lawrence Hill, the engineer at the back, knew it, but he never told Frank Holland.
He didn't communicate to him that he had only 1 locomotive at a dynamic, the other one was out. The helper engineer thought that the dispatcher would notify the lead engineer.
Call in the helper.
This is the helper.
You got all your dynamics?
Yeah, I'm in full.
So when Holland asks Hill at the back of the train if he has all of his dynamics, Hill says yes. But he only means in the 1 engine. It's a startling discovery. Holland doesn't have anywhere near the braking power he thinks he does. Investigators studying the black boxes uncover one more secret of the train's terrifying ride down the mountain.
Something must be wrong up there.
When Lawrence Hill pulled the emergency brakes, he actually canceled out the dynamic brakes. It's a safety feature to keep the wheels from locking and the train from sliding down the tracks. In this case, with the air brakes melting, the dynamic brakes were the only thing holding the train back. Putting the emergency brakes on actually sped the train up.
When the emergency brakes are applied, what happens is you lose your dynamic braking and you've got a runaway train now.
But Pugh is still puzzled. According to all the paperwork, 7551 East was hauling 3.5 million kilos of cargo. At that weight, even with his crippled engines, Holland should have been able to hold his speed going down the mountain. To find out why he couldn't, investigators turned their attention to the days before the accident. 7551 East was pulling a shipment for Lake Minerals. 5 days before the trip began, the company's superintendent drops off the proper paperwork with Thomas Blair, who works for Southern Pacific. The paperwork outlines what's in the shipment and, normally, how much it weighs.
Thanks.
In this case, though, the weight was not filled in. Lake Minerals believed each of the cars was filled to its maximum, 90,000 kilos.
Hey! Hey!
Since that's what the company expected, Lake Minerals didn't think there was any reason to put the number down. But Blair knows that to fill out the proper computer forms, he'll need to have a weight, or the train won't be able to leave the train yard. Blair has been working with Southern Pacific for 17 years. He's seen thousands of freight cars leave his yard. He makes an educated guess that the material in each car on the train weighs 54,000 kilos. But Blair's guess is a tragic miscalculation. Every single freight car on 7551 East is actually carrying 36,000 kilos more material than he estimated. Across 69 cars, it means that the train is actually more than 6 jumbo jets, 2.5 million kilos heavier than anyone thinks it is.
Nobody caught the fact that the weights were way under.
Train orders, train list, and tonnage profile.
From then on, the engineer had a profile of the train that showed 6,100 ton.
I'll be back at 3. Okay.
He operated that way, and it was wrong. It was dramatically wrong. I mean, that was only 2/3 of the weight of that train.
That train was doomed, and we just didn't know it.
Frank Holland was in trouble before his trip began. Even if all of his engines were working, it would have been a difficult trip down the mountain. With all the problems he had, he simply didn't have the power to slow his enormous train down. Crashing into San Bernardino was all but inevitable from the beginning. The wreck of 7551 East was a preventable disaster. Investigators are about to discover that the explosion which followed didn't have to happen either. In May of 1989, twin disasters shatter the town of San Bernardino, California. A train derailment and a gas line explosion kill 6 people and destroy more than a dozen houses. Investigators comb through the ashes to learn how the two events are linked. The pipeline was 2 meters below ground. And in the days after the derailment, CalNev examined it closely. They couldn't find a single dent or crack where the train had broken through the earth. The train crash hadn't seemed to weaken the pipeline. And when gas began pumping through the pipe, there was no loss of pressure, no warning sign of a problem.
They started operating and brought it up to about 1,600 pounds, and all of the pressure readings at various places along the pipeline looked normal.
Since the derailment itself didn't cause the rupture, investigators continue their search. They study the pipeline for clues. Even though the fire burned for hours, the piece of pipe that burst has not been destroyed.
When the pipe opened up, it caused a rupture in the pipe that was sort of what we term as a fish mouth shape. And at the widest area, it was about 4 inches wide, and it was about 2.5 feet long.
Like forensic investigators, the NTSB looks for a telltale fingerprint that will help them discover how the pipe broke. Near the spot where the pipe ruptured, investigators find dents and several deeper gouges. The marks are like wounds on a murder victim. If investigators can find out what caused the marks, they'll discover what caused the pipeline to burst.
We knew that there were deposits of hardened steel left in the gouges, We knew that whatever piece of equipment had damaged the pipe had teeth on it that were hardened steel.
There are several possible suspects. A number of front-end loaders and one large backhoe used during the cleanup all had hardened steel teeth. But Batten can never pinpoint the blame.
Well, the NTSB determined that the damage to the pipeline was done during one of two phases, either the cleanup of the train wreckage or it was done during the time in which the trona was being cleaned up after the train wreckage had been removed.
Two mistakes resulted in a pair of disasters for San Bernardino and the death of 6 people. In its final report on the disasters, the NTSB doesn't blame Frank Holland, saying his belief that he had enough braking power to stop the train was perfectly reasonable. Holland still rides the rails, but he's never made the trip down the San Gabriel Mountains again.
Psychologically, I just don't think I could take it. I don't think I could relive that. Every time I went down, I would relive it. And I choose not to do that. It'd just be too painful.
Calnev, the company that operated the pipeline, was called to account for not checking it after the cleanup operations were completed. Lawsuits against the company were settled out of court.
Calnev, in hindsight, I think would agree that they should have been much more thorough in their inspection. They got comfortable with what they saw, and they made an assessment without adequate information that it was an undamaged pipeline and okay to operate.
Thomas Blair, who incorrectly filled in the paperwork, was never charged. But after the disaster, Southern Pacific changed its rules so that every freight car without a specified weight was assumed to be carrying its maximum allowable load. Southern Pacific also settled a number of lawsuits out of court. The company no longer exists. It was bought out years after the disaster. Trains continue to run past San Bernardino, but many of the families involved in the disaster moved away.
Trains were still coming down out of Cajon Pass. And so a person couldn't help but go in their mind go to where, what if that this thing could happen again?
Houses aren't allowed beside the tracks anymore. All that's left is an ugly scar of land. There's no monument here to mourn those who died, or to mark the day when disaster came to Duffy Street.